One handwritten report. 5 sentences. Signed by the finest fighter pilot in Germany on a summer morning in 1940. Every word of it was true. And every word of it reinforced assumptions that would later contribute to Germany's misunderstanding of the Battle of Britain. The pilot's name was Werner Mulders. He was 27 years old. He wore the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which he had received in May of that year for his victories over France. He had 35 confirmed aerial kills. He was, that August, the best fighter pilot alive. And in the beginning of August, 1940, at a secret airfield called Rechlin, 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin, he climbed into a captured British aircraft, flew it for 40 minutes, and wrote a report that reinforced the Luftwaffe leadership's growing confidence before the Battle of Britain. They were not about to win the war. In the 81 days that followed, the aircraft Werner Mulders had rated technically inferior would later be credited with destroying roughly 656 German aircraft during the battle. More than any other British weapons system in the entire battle. This is the story of how the best fighter pilot in Germany told the truth. And how the truth cost his country the war in the air. Rechlin Airfield sits deep in the Mecklenburg Lake country, 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin. The air, on that August morning, smells of aviation fuel and cut grass. The sky above the concrete apron is the pale, uncertain blue of late German summer. Somewhere in the distance, a single engine coughs to life, then settles into a smooth, purring idle. This is the most secret airfield in the Third Reich. Everything the Luftwaffe wants to know about the aircraft it will fight, it learns here. Captured French bombers. A Polish Pizel. A British ferry battle pulled from a field in Belgium. They come to Rechlin to be measured. Today, there is a new arrival on the apron. It sits apart from the sleek Messerschmitts around it, as though the ground crew has instinctively left it space, the way one leaves space around something one does not quite understand. Its fabric skin carries the patched markings of hasty overpainting. Its undercarriage legs are wider than any German fighter's. Its nose is blunter. Its lines are thicker, rounder, older. It looks tired. It looks, to a Luftwaffe engineer walking past, with a clipboard, like something the war had already left behind. It is a Hawker Hurricane Mark I, captured intact somewhere in the collapse of France 3 months earlier. And it has been brought here to be judged by the finest fighter pilot in Germany. Werner Mulders stands not quite 5'10". He has the compact, unhurried movements of a man who has stopped being surprised by things in the sky. 14 of his kills were earned in the Spanish Civil War, where he had learned his trade, with the Condor Legion. 21 more came after the invasion of Poland. He has flown against the best pilots France and Britain have sent up, and he has come back every time. He is not careless. He is not vain. He is a devout Catholic, who reads philosophy, and writes long, careful letters to his mother. His men call him Vaitai, Father, because he is calm when they are afraid, and because he brings them home. This morning, he has come to Rechlin to fly the enemy's machine. He has already flown a captured Spitfire. That was earlier in the summer. He walked around the Supermarine, ran his hand along the elliptical wing, climbed into the cockpit, and taken it up. He remembers the way the controls felt light in his hand. He remembers the strange, distant thought that had come to him at 15,000 feet, the thought that this aircraft, in the right hands, might be the equal of anything the Luftwaffe possessed. He had not written that in his report. He had written, instead, that the Spitfire was miserable, as a fighting aircraft. He wrote that its two-pitch propeller was primitive. He wrote that its carburetor cut out under -G, meaning any German pilot could escape simply by pushing the stick forward and diving. He wrote what was technically true. But he had ended his Spitfire assessment with 4 words that traveled up the chain of command and became the private opinion of the German Air Staff. The Spitfire is 1 class better. Now, a captured Hurricane sits on the apron in front of him. Mulders walks around it slowly. The chief test pilot is speaking to him about fuel loads, ballast, permissible dive speeds. Mulders is listening only partially. He is looking at the wings. They are broad. They are thick. They belong to a design philosophy that had been surrendered by every serious European Air Force before the decade began. He climbs the wing route. He settles into the cockpit. It smells of British engine oil and dust. The panel is arranged in a way that feels awkward to him, controls in the wrong places, throttle on the wrong side. He goes through his checks. The Merlin engine catches, coughs, steadies. He takes it up. For 40 minutes, he puts the Hurricane through every maneuver he knows. He climbs it. He notes the way the aircraft responds. He notes what it will not do. When he lands, he does not smile. He does not shake his head. He climbs down, walks across the apron, and sits at a table in the wooden office beside the hangar. He writes. His handwriting is precise. He does not cross out. He does not hesitate. It was very interesting to carry out the flight trials at Rechlin, with the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Both types are very simple to fly compared to our aircraft, and childishly easy to take off and land. He pauses. Then continues. The Hurricane is good-natured, and turns well, but its performance is decidedly inferior to that of the Me-109. It has strong stick forces, and is lazy on the ailerons. He looks up briefly. Then he writes the sentence that will kill more Germans than any single line of prose written in the war. The Spitfire is one class better. He signs the assessment. He hands it to the officer waiting at the door. The officer carries it to a courier. The courier carries it to Berlin. Pause on that. Because everything that will follow in this story turns on those 5 sentences. Werner Mulders was not lying. Werner Mulders was not exaggerating. Werner Mulders was not making a mistake. Every word he wrote was true. The Hurricane was slower than the Messerschmitt 109. Its climb rate was inferior at every altitude. Above 20,000 feet, it was outclassed. In a straight fight, one Hurricane against one 109, at equal altitude, at equal energy, the German aircraft would win most of the time. The specifications proved it. The wind tunnel proved it. Mulder's hands on the stick proved it. He measured what could be measured. The problem was not what he measured. The problem was what he did not measure. What he could not measure. What no man alive could have measured, standing on a concrete apron in Mecklenburg on a clear August morning, with the war 3 weeks away from its decisive phase. He did not measure the 9 minutes it took to refuel and rearm a Hurricane at Biggin Hill, against the 26 minutes a Spitfire required at the same airfield. He did not measure the fabric fuselage that let cannon shells pass straight through without shattering the aircraft into scrap. He did not measure the 32 Hurricane squadrons Fighter Command had committed against the 19 Spitfire squadrons, a ratio the Luftwaffe would not learn until far too late. He did not measure Lord Beaverbrook, 70 kilometers south of him in London, screaming at factory managers to double their output. He did not measure a 58-year-old air marshal named Hugh Dowding, whose nickname was Stuffy, who had spent 4 years building a system of radar stations and telephone lines that would render every one of Mulder's calculations obsolete. He measured the aircraft. He did not measure the war it was going to fight. His 5 sentences, in that careful handwriting, traveled from Rechlin to Berlin. They landed on the desk of a man named Joseph Schmid. Colonel Joseph Schmid was 39 years old that summer. He was heavy-set, jovial, well-liked in the officers' mess. His nickname was Beppo. His official title was Chief of the 5th Section of the Luftwaffe General Staff. His actual role was Chief of Intelligence for the German air war against Britain. Joseph Schmid had never flown a combat mission. He had never learned English. He had never visited Britain. And he was the man responsible for telling Hermann Göring what the Royal Air Force could do. In July of 1940, 4 weeks before Mulders climbed into that hurricane, Beppo Schmid had compiled a comparative intelligence study. It ran to 15 pages. It was titled Studie Blau, Blue Study. It drew on every scrap of information German intelligence possessed about the RAF, its aircraft, its bases, its pilots, its industrial capacity. Its conclusions were unambiguous. The RAF was inferior in equipment, inferior in training, inferior in leadership. Its fighters could not match the Messerschmitt 109. Its industrial base could not replace losses at the required rate. Schmid estimated the total RAF frontline fighter strength at between 200 and 675 machines. The actual number, on the day he submitted the report, was over 600 serviceable aircraft, with more coming off the production lines every week. Schmid did not know this. Schmid could not have known this. Because Schmid did not know the thing that mattered most. He did not know that Britain had covered its coastline in radar towers. He did not know that those towers fed into a network of underground filter rooms, where young women in blue uniforms moved plotting counters across enormous maps of the English coast, tracking every German aircraft the moment it lifted off from northern France. He did not know that those filter rooms fed into sector operations rooms, where controllers spoke to airborne fighters through headsets, guiding them onto interceptions, with an accuracy that made the German reliance on ground observers and radio intercepts look primitive by comparison. He did not know that a Heinkel taking off from Rennes would appear on a British plotting table before the wheels had left French concrete. He did not know that the hurricane he had heard about in Mulder's report, that inferior, fabric-covered relic, was the aircraft this entire invisible system had been built to place in the right position, at the right altitude, at the right moment, to kill. Beppo Schmid was going to send the Luftwaffe to war against the Phantom. Against a smaller RAF than the one that actually existed. Against a weaker RAF than the one that actually existed. Against a less well-equipped, less well-organized, less well-supplied RAF than the one that actually existed. And at the center of his miscalculation, invisible in every column of his report, sat the aircraft Werner Mulders had judged good-natured and inferior. 656 German aircraft. More than any other British weapons system in the entire battle. The aircraft Werner Mulders had climbed out of, that August morning, and dismissed in 5 careful sentences, was going to destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to bomb Britain by daylight, before the leaves were off the trees. He did not know that yet. He could not have known it. He had done his job. He had flown the enemy machine. He had told his superiors what he had found. He had written the truth, as he understood it, in a language that was precise, and unemotional and entirely correct on its own terms. He walked away from that report and went back to his squadron in the Pas-de-Calais. Within a week, he would be leading his men over the Channel, hunting Spitfires and Hurricanes, over Kent and Sussex, and the mouth of the Thames. He did not know that 80 days from that morning at Rechlin, the aircraft he had rated inferior would have shot down more Germans than any weapons system in the war so far. He did not know that 15 months from that morning at Rechlin, he himself would be dead. Not in combat. Not against a British fighter. In a transport aircraft, on a foggy November afternoon, flying to a funeral. He did not know that his technically accurate assessment would later be interpreted too narrowly by the Luftwaffe's leadership. He climbed into his staff car. The Hurricane was rolled back into its hangar. And in a small office in Berlin, Beppo Schmid took Werner Mulders' assessment, filed it in his growing dossier on the Royal Air Force, and prepared to advise the Reichsmarschall on how quickly Britain could be brought to its knees. The clock was running. Either of them could hear it. To understand the aircraft Werner Mulders had just dismissed, we must leave the Rechlin apron behind and travel west. West to a red brick drawing office in Kingston upon Thames, in the county of Surrey, England. The year is 1934. 6 years before Mulders wrote his report. Inside the office, a man in his early 40s bends over a drafting table. His shirt sleeves are rolled to the elbow. A pencil sits behind his ear. He is thin, sharp-featured, with the deep-set eyes of a man who does not sleep enough. When he speaks to his draftsman, his voice is quiet, clipped, and entirely without warmth. His name is Sidney Cam. He is 41 years old. He is the chief designer at Hawker Aircraft Limited. And he is, at this moment, the loneliest man in British aviation. Sidney Cam was not born to this trade. His father was a carpenter in Windsor. He was the eldest of 12 children. 12. In a small house that smelled of sawdust and boiled cabbage, with a mother who never once had a day to herself. Young Sidney left school at 15. He built model airplanes for pocket money. He built man-carrying gliders in a barn behind the family home when he was 19. He had no engineering degree. He had no university. He had no wealthy patron. He had only the belief, formed somewhere in his teenage years, and never afterwards questioned, that he understood aircraft better than any man in England. The people who worked under him at Hawker did not disagree. They also, mostly, could not stand him. He had a one-track mind, one draftsman would remember, decades later, in an interview conducted long after Cam was in his grave. His aircraft were right. And everybody had to work on them to get them right. You could not have a better aeronautical engineer to work under. You could not, sometimes, have a worse man to work for. That is what the men who built the Hurricane said about the man who designed it. In 1934, Sidney Cam was designing something that most of his professional peers considered a mistake. The Royal Air Force had put out a specification for a new fighter. 8 machine guns. Enclosed cockpit. Retractable undercarriage. Speed above 300 miles per hour. Everyone in the industry knew what the answer was going to look like. Everyone in the industry knew what the future looked like. The future looked like stressed skin aluminum. Stressed skin was the new gospel. Every serious aircraft designer in Europe was moving to it. You built the aircraft out of load-bearing aluminum panels riveted to internal frames. The skin itself carried the stresses of flight. It was elegant. It was modern. It was, in the wind tunnel, faster. 250 miles away in Southampton, a man named Reginald Mitchell was drawing a stressed skin fighter for Supermarine. It had an elliptical wing. It was beautiful. In 3 years, the world would know its name. Sidney Cam looked at the stressed skin future, and he refused it. He kept his rear fuselage as a frame of steel, and he did not do this out of laziness. He did not do this out of ignorance. Sidney Cam was many things, but he was not a man who did not understand what his competitors were doing. He did it because he had spent 30 years watching aircraft come home damaged. He had watched them land, with their wings shredded by machine gun fire. He had watched them come back, with tail sections torn away by anti-aircraft shells. He had watched, in his imagination, what the next war was going to do to the aircraft that flew in it. And he had decided something the specification sheets could not measure. A cannon shell going through stressed skin aluminum cracked it, warped it, pulled the whole airframe out of alignment. The aircraft might fly home. Then it needed a factory. Precision jigs. Specialist metalworkers. Weeks of skilled labor. A Spitfire that had been hit hard was a Spitfire out of the war. A cannon shell going through doped fabric passed straight through. It did not detonate on impact. It did not tear the structure. A rigger with basic tools, in a grass field beside an airfield, could cut out the damaged tubes, weld in replacements, patch the fabric, and have the aircraft ready to fly again in a week. Sidney Cam was not building a race horse. Sidney Cam was building a farm horse. And in the war he could see coming, he suspected that farm horses were going to matter more than race horses. His first prototype flew on the 6th of November, 1935. It was designated the Hawker Hurricane. It entered squadron service in December of 1937, becoming the first monoplane fighter in RAF history, and the first British aircraft to exceed 300 miles per hour in level flight. By the summer of 1940, 32 fighter command squadrons flew the Hurricane. 19 flew the Spitfire. Every serious observer in the Air Ministry knew the Hurricane was the older design. Every serious observer expected it to be phased out by 1941. Sidney Kem had built the aircraft they were going to fight the Battle of Britain in. And he had built it, as it turned out, exactly right. There were two things Kem had put into the Hurricane that Mulders had not felt in his 40-minute flight test. The first was the thing we have just discussed: repairability. The Hurricane could often be turned around much faster than more complex fighters. The fabric-covered tubes that let a wounded aircraft go back into the fight the same day. The second was the guns. The Hurricane's wings were thick. Thicker than the Spitfires. Thicker than the Messerschmitts. Those thick wings made the aircraft slower. They made it climb worse. They made it, on paper, inferior. They also made it something no other fighter in the sky could match. They made it a stable gun platform. 8 Browning 303 machine guns, mounted close to the fuselage centerline, in a tight cluster. Each firing 1,150 rounds per minute. All 8 converging their fire at a point 250 yards ahead of the aircraft. In a 2-second burst, a Hurricane pilot delivered approximately 320 rounds of ammunition into an area the size of a Heinkel's cockpit. The Hurricane did not need to be the fastest aircraft in the sky. It needed to sit steady behind a bomber for 2 seconds. And Sidney Kem had built it, quite deliberately, to sit steady behind a bomber for 2 seconds. Nobody had told him to. He had figured it out himself. 6 years later, on a summer morning in 1940, that decision was going to matter more than any decision made in any drawing office in Europe. But an aircraft, by itself, is only a machine. An aircraft, by itself, wins nothing. The Hurricane needed a system. It needed a system that would tell it where to be, and when, and at what altitude. It needed a system that would keep it fed, with fuel and ammunition, and replacement parts. It needed a system that would tell it which of the specks in the sky was a Messerschmitt to be avoided, and which was a Dornier to be killed. That system was not built by Sidney Kem. That system was built by a man named Hugh Dowding. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Caswall Tremenhere Dowding. 58 years old in the summer of 1940. Known throughout the Royal Air Force by a single nickname, spoken with a mixture of respect, frustration, and something like fear. Stuffy. He had earned the name honestly. He did not drink at the officers' mess. He did not tell jokes. He did not laugh at other men's jokes. He had lost his only son in a training accident years earlier, and he had never afterwards recovered the ability to be light with anyone. He kept his distance. He kept his opinions to himself until asked. And then he stated them in a voice so quiet that men had to lean forward to hear him. Since 1936, Hugh Dowding had been the head of Fighter Command. For 4 years, he had been building something that had no equivalent anywhere else in the world. Along the entire eastern and southern coastline of Britain, from the Shetland Islands down to Land's End, he had built a chain of radar stations. Chain home. Great steel towers, 300 and every incoming aircraft, from the moment it crossed the French coast, appeared as a blip on a British screen. The blips fed into filter rooms. Underground bunkers, staffed largely by young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, wearing headsets, moving wooden counters across enormous plotting tables that mapped the sky above Britain in real time. The filter rooms fed into sector operations rooms spread across the country. In each sector operations room, controllers spoke through radios to airborne fighters. Vector 270. Angels 20. Bandits ahead, 12 o'clock. By the time a Luftwaffe formation reached the English coast, British fighters were already climbing to meet it, already at the correct altitude, already in the correct position. The Germans could not understand how this was happening. They had radar. They had good radar. What they did not have was the system that turned radar information into fighters in the right place at the right time. They relied on radio intercepts and ground observers who could not see through cloud. Their pilots flew into engagements half blind. Dowding's pilots did not. Beneath Dowding, running the critical sector of this system, was a man named Keith Park. Air Vice Marshal Keith Rodney Park. 48 years old. Born in Thames, on New Zealand's North Island. Son of a Scottish geology professor. Wounded at Gallipoli in 1915. Wounded again on the Somme in 1916. Transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, because he had been declared medically unfit for further infantry service. He had spent the interwar years being passed over for promotion by men with better connections and less ability. In April of 1940, 3 months before the battle began, he was given command of No. 11 Group. No. 11 Group covered the southeast of England, London, the Thames estuary, the airfields of Kent, the entire path any German bomber would have to fly to strike anywhere that mattered. Keith Park kept his own personal Hawker Hurricane at his headquarters. A dark blue aircraft, unmarked. He flew it himself between his airfields, unannounced, so that when he arrived, his squadron commanders had no time to hide anything from him. He wanted to see the war his men were fighting, with his own eyes. And Keith Park understood something about the Hurricane that the specification sheets did not reveal. The Messerschmitts did not matter. The Messerschmitts could not drop bombs. The Messerschmitts could shoot down British fighters, could damage the RAF, could make things unpleasant. But a Messerschmitt returning to France, with an empty ammunition tank, had accomplished nothing strategic. A Heinkel returning to France, with an empty ammunition tank, had bombed London. The bombers were the target. On the 19th of August, 1940, Keith Park issued an instruction to his squadron commanders. The wording was direct. Engage the bombers. The Spitfires, faster, better at altitude, would try to hold off the Messerschmitt escorts. The Hurricanes, slower, tougher, more numerous, with their steady gun platform, and their converging fire at 250 yards, would go for the bombers. That was the doctrine. Reality, as it always does in war, refused to be that clean. Controllers could not always distinguish fighter formations from bomber formations. Squadrons scrambled with whatever aircraft were ready. The neat division of labor collapsed, again and again, in the fog of a 50-aircraft raid appearing over Kent at 30,000 feet, with 8 minutes warning. But the intent was clear. And in enough engagements it held. Hurricanes pressing into the bomber streams. Guns converging at 250 yards. Spitfires above them, trying to keep the 109s occupied. The Dowding system feeding them information every 8 seconds. And behind all of it, in London, one more man. Lord Beaverbrook. Born William Maxwell Aitken, in Ontario, Canada, in 1879. A newspaper proprietor. A press baron. 61 years old in 1940. Small, pugnacious, and utterly indifferent to formal military process. On the 14th of May, 1940, Winston Churchill had summoned him and appointed him Minister of Aircraft Production. A new ministry invented for the emergency. Beaverbrook did not know how to build an aircraft. Beaverbrook knew how to run a newspaper. He treated the aircraft industry the way he had treated the Daily Express. He slashed production priorities to 5 aircraft types. Everything else was cancelled or delayed. He seized the vast new Castle Bromwich factory from the Nuffield organization, which had been failing to produce Spitfires on schedule, and handed it to Vickers. He phoned factory managers at 3 in the morning and screamed at them. Between the 1st of June and the 1st of November, 1940, British factories produced 1,367 Hurricanes and 724 Spitfires. German fighter production, in July of 1940, was approximately 240 aircraft. Britain was building fighters at more. The civilian repair organization returned battle-damaged aircraft to service at as many as 250 machines a week at the peak of the battle. The Hurricane's fabric fuselage and bolted tube structure made it, exactly as Sidney Cam had intended, the ideal candidate for field repair. One Hurricane pilot, a young man named Tom Neal of 249 Squadron, would write in his memoirs decades later that replacement aircraft simply appeared at his airfield every morning, as if delivered by angels. Where they came from, no one knew. The Luftwaffe was not fighting a fixed number of aircraft. The Luftwaffe was fighting a system that renewed itself, night after night, faster than any German calculation had predicted was possible. And Beppo Schmid, in his office in Berlin, did not know this either. Now the raids came. On the 13th of August, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched what it called Adler Tag. Eagle Day. The opening blow of the concentrated air campaign. 1,485 sorties flown across the Channel. The German planning was chaotic. Some formations flew, without fighter escorts, having received a recall signal, that never reached their bomber crews. Hurricanes of 601 Squadron intercepted a formation of Messerschmitt 110 heavy fighters over the south coast and destroyed 6 of them in a single engagement. By nightfall, the RAF had lost 13 fighters. The Luftwaffe had lost approximately 47 aircraft. In Berlin, Schmid analyzed the day and concluded that fighter command was near breaking. He reported to Göring that the RAF had fewer than 300 serviceable fighters remaining. The actual number, after the day's losses, and that night's repairs and replacements, was higher than it had been on the day the battle began. On the 18th of August, 5 days later, the Luftwaffe launched its heaviest coordinated attack of the entire battle. Historians would later call it the hardest day. A formation of Dornier bombers came in low, over Kent, aiming for the RAF fighter airfield at Kenley, just south of London. 111 Squadron was scrambled to intercept. Their Hurricanes came down out of cloud at the last possible moment, and broke the Dornier formation apart, before it reached the target. Several of the bombers were destroyed. The airfield was hit, but not destroyed. And that evening, the German bomber crews, who made it back to the aircraft that had come at them out of the cloud had not been Spitfires. The aircraft that had come at them out of the cloud had been the other one. The slower one. The one they had been told not to worry about. The gap between what the German bomber crews knew and what the German High Command believed had opened. It would keep widening for the rest of the summer. There is one more man who belongs in this section of the story. His name is James Brindley Nicholson. He is 23 years old. He is a flight lieutenant in 249 Squadron, based at RAF Boscombe Down in Wiltshire. He was married in 1938. His wife's name is Muriel. They have no children yet. He has flown Hurricanes in combat for exactly 1 week. On the afternoon of the 16th of August, 1940, near Southampton, Nicholson's Hurricane is hit by 4 cannon shells from a German fighter. The first shell wounds him in the foot. The second shell shatters the cockpit canopy, sending a piece of perspex into his left eye. The third shell strikes the gravity fuel tank, positioned in the Hurricane just forward of the cockpit, between the engine and the pilot. The tank ignites. Any pilot who has been trained in the past 30 years, in any air force in the world, has been trained to bail out of an aircraft that is on fire. The training is not complicated. Undo the harness. Roll the aircraft. Push clear. Pull the ripcord. Nicholson does not bail out. He looks through the flames. Ahead of him, at the edge of his blurred, burning vision, he sees the German fighter that has just shot him. It is close. It has not seen him. It is turning away, believing him already dead. Nicholson pushes the throttle forward. He centers his gun sight on the German aircraft. His hands are burning. The skin on his fingers is coming away against the leather of the throttle grip. He does not release the throttle. He fires. The German fighter falls out of the sky. Only then does Nicholson roll his own aircraft onto its back, release his harness, and drop out of the burning cockpit. He is on fire when his parachute opens. On the ground below, a Home Guard unit sees a parachute descending and, in the confusion of the day, assumes the man on the end of it is a German pilot. They open fire on him from the ground. Some of the shots hit him. He is still on fire. He survives. He is transferred to a military hospital. His burns are severe. His hands, his face, his legs. 6 months later, he is awarded the Victoria Cross. It is the only Victoria Cross given to any pilot of RAF Fighter Command in the entire Second World War. 2,937 aircrew flew in Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. James Nicholson was the only one to receive Britain's highest award for valor. He was 23 years old. He was flying the aircraft the Luftwaffe had rated as not worth worrying about. There is one more thing to say before we close this part. The gravity fuel tank sat just forward of the Hurricane's cockpit for reasons of engineering economy. It had been placed there in 1934. Sidney Chem had approved the layout. Nobody, in 1934, had anticipated what modern cannon fire would do to that tank. Hurricane pilots caught fire more often than pilots of any other British type in the battle. At the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, in Sussex, a plastic surgeon named Archibald McIndoe began receiving them. He was a New Zealander. He was 40 years old. He had trained at the Mayo Clinic. He was gruff, direct, and utterly devoted to the young men who came through his ward doors. He rebuilt their faces. He rebuilt their hands. He rebuilt, when he could, the men themselves. The ones who survived his surgeries began to call themselves, in dark humor, the Guinea Pig Club. Because they were experimental. Because everything McIndoe was doing to them was being done for the first time. The club would be formally founded in July of 1941, but the men were already gathering in his ward by the autumn of 1940. Many of them were Hurricane pilots. When Hugh Dowding was told what was happening in East Grinstead, he ordered that every Hurricane gravity tank be fitted with a self-sealing Lenatex rubber coating. It helped. It did not entirely solve the problem. This is not the story of a perfect aircraft. This is not the story of a machine that had no flaws. Men burned inside Hurricanes because of a decision made by Sidney Chem in a drawing office in Kingston in 1934. That decision had been made without foresight of what modern cannon shells would do. Men lived the rest of their lives with new faces because of it. The story is more complicated than the legend. The Hurricane was the right aircraft, in the right numbers, in the right system, at the right time. It was also, on a particular sunny afternoon in August, the aircraft that set a 23-year-old flight lieutenant on fire. Both things are true. And in Berlin, on the desk of Colonel Beppo Schmid, the intelligence reports continued to arrive. They continued to say that the RAF was breaking. They continued to be wrong. The 7th of September, 1940. A Saturday. Late afternoon. Along the cliffs of northern France, in a chateau requisitioned for the occasion, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring stands, with a pair of field glasses raised to the horizon. He is 57 years old. He weighs nearly 300 pounds. His pale blue Luftwaffe uniform strains at the buttons across his chest. Around him stand his staff officers, silent, waiting. Somewhere out over the channel, 348 German bombers, escorted by more than 600 fighters, are heading not for the Royal Air Force airfields they have been striking for a month, but for something new. They are heading for London. Göring has made the decision himself. He has convinced Hitler. He has convinced the Luftwaffe General Staff. He has convinced, above all, Beppo Schmid, whose intelligence reports have told him for 6 weeks that the RAF is nearly finished. The reasoning is straightforward, or so it seems to the men standing in that chateau. Fighter Command has been battered. Its airfields are damaged. Its pilots are exhausted. One heavy blow at the capital, one decisive terror strike, and Britain will sue for peace. That is what Beppo Schmid's numbers say. Beppo Schmid's numbers are wrong. 600 kilometers away, at the underground operations room of No. 11 Group, RAF Uxbridge, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park stands, with his hands behind his back, watching the plotting table below him fill with wooden counters. He does not need to be told what is happening. He watches the counters move. He watches them not turn toward the airfields at Biggin Hill, or Kenley, or North Weald, or Hornchurch. He watches them go straight up the Thames estuary, toward the docks, toward the East End, toward the city. Something inside Keith Park shifts. He will say afterwards, in an interview many years later, in a voice that had not lost its New Zealand vowels, the sentence that historians would use to summarize the entire turning point of the Battle of Britain. The Hun lost the battle when he switched from bombing my fighter stations to bombing London, because the airfields could now recover. The sector operations rooms could be repaired. The runways patched. The ground crews rested. The Hurricanes could often be rearmed and refueled remarkably quickly before returning to combat. And the Hurricanes now had exactly what Sidney Chem had designed them to kill. A stream of bombers, flying a predictable route, at a predictable altitude, on a predictable timetable, up the mouth of the largest river in England. The perfect target. For 6 years, the aircraft had been waiting for this. On the 15th of September, 1940, a Sunday, the Luftwaffe launched what it intended to be the decisive blow. 2 massive raids came in across London, one in the late morning, one in the early afternoon. More than 1,000 German aircraft were airborne over southern England before noon. Every squadron in 11 Group scrambled. Then every squadron in 12 Group. Then every squadron in 10 Group. 245 British fighters engaged the German formations, in an air battle, so vast that pilots on both sides described afterwards being unable to see the sky, through the aircraft in it. The Hurricanes went for the bombers. The Spitfires held off the Messerschmitts. The system that Hugh Dowding had spent 4 years building performed exactly as it had been designed to perform. At 3 in the afternoon, Winston Churchill was visiting the Uxbridge operations room. He had come to see for himself. He was 65 years old, in his black civilian coat, watching the plotting table, with a cigar clamped between his teeth. He asked Keith Park a question. "What other reserves have we?" Keith Park turned to him and answered, "There are none." Every fighter in southern England was already in the sky. Every pilot who could still stand had already been strapped into a cockpit. If the German second wave had brought fresh formations to break through the exhausted defenders, there was nothing behind them to stop it. The German second wave arrived, and found the same defenders in the sky. Because the Hurricanes had been rearmed and refueled in 9 minutes, and the pilots had gone back up. That rapid turnaround became one of several important advantages enjoyed by Fighter Command. That was Sidney Cam's decision in 1934 coming back to save the country. By nightfall, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 60 aircraft. The RAF had lost 29. The German bomber losses were catastrophic, and the surviving bomber crews returning to their bases in France were telling their intelligence officers what they had told them on the 18th of August, and again in early September, and now once more on this Sunday afternoon. The aircraft killing them were not what they had been briefed to expect. 2 days later, on the 17th of September, Adolf Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. Many historians regard this as the decisive turning point of the Battle of Britain. Nobody in Fighter Command knew that yet. The raids continued. The dying continued. The Battle of Britain would run officially until the 31st of October, another 6 weeks of combat. But the decision had been made on the 15th of September, in a sky filled with Hurricanes going for bombers, and Spitfires going for Messerschmitts, and a system that had held together under a pressure the Luftwaffe had believed impossible. There are names now that must be spoken, because they will not appear on any monument you have ever visited. The first name is Joseph František. He is 26 years old. He is Czech. He was born in Otislavec, in Moravia, in 1914. When the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, he escaped south. He flew with the Polish Air Force during the German invasion in September. When Poland fell, he escaped west, and flew with the French Air Force during the Battle of France. When France fell, he escaped to Britain. He arrived at RAF Nordholt, on the outskirts of London, in July of 1940. He was assigned to 303 Squadron. It was a Polish squadron, flying Hurricanes. The Poles had accepted him, because he had fought with them the previous September, and because he had nowhere else to go. 303 Squadron would become the highest-scoring RAF squadron of the entire Battle of Britain. 126 claimed victories in 42 days of combat. Their commanding officer, a Polish Air Force major named Zdzisław Krasnodębski, had watched his country be crushed, and had brought his men here to make the Germans pay. They flew Hurricanes. Joseph František claimed 17 kills in September of 1940. It was the highest individual score claimed by any RAF pilot in the entire battle. He was not disciplined. He was not steady. He would break away from formation to hunt German aircraft alone. His squadron mates complained about him. His squadron leader tried to ground him. Nothing worked. He had been fighting Germans for a year and a half by the time he arrived at Nordholt. He had lost his country, his family, his second country, his third country. There was nothing left in him except the hunt. On the morning of the 8th of October, 1940, Joseph František took off from Nordholt on a routine patrol. His Hurricane crashed near Ewell, in Surrey, in circumstances that have never been fully explained. He was not shot down. He was not, as far as anyone could determine, in combat. He may have blacked out. He may have been performing aerobatics too low to the ground. He may have been exhausted. He was killed instantly. He was 26 years old. He is buried in Northwood Cemetery, in northwest London. His headstone is a standard Commonwealth War Graves marker, identical to thousands of others. There is nothing about it to indicate that the man beneath it was the highest-scoring fighter pilot of the Battle of Britain. The second name is Archie McKellar. Squadron Leader Archibald Ashmore McKellar. He is 20 years old. He is Scottish. He was born in Paisley, near Glasgow, in April of 1912. Before the war, he had trained as a stockbroker. He had a wife. He had a life that did not involve aircraft. He joined the Royal Auxiliary Air Force before the war as a weekend flyer. When the war came, he was called up. By September of 1940, he was commanding 605 Squadron, flying Hurricanes out of Croydon, on the southern edge of London. McKellar was extraordinary. In one engagement, on the 7th of October, he shot down 5 Messerschmitt 109s in a single sortie. 19 confirmed kills. Possibly more. He was fearless in a way that his flight commanders found frightening. On the 1st of November, 1940, he was killed in combat over Kent. His death would be small news, if it were reported at all. Because the Battle of Britain, according to the official chronology, had ended the day before. It had ended on the 31st of October. Archie McKellar died. He is not on the official list of pilots who died in the Battle of Britain. His name does not appear on the Battle of Britain Memorial in the correct list. He died in what was already, administratively, a different war. 20 years old. 19 kills. 1 day. The third name is Hugh Dowding. The man who built the system. On the 24th of November, 1940, 3 weeks after the Battle of Britain officially ended, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was removed from his command of Fighter Command. He was not fired for incompetence. He was not fired for failure. He had won the greatest defensive air battle in history. He had done the impossible. He was fired because his subordinates had lobbied against him. There had been an internal dispute during the battle over tactics. Some of his senior officers had wanted to use large formations of fighters, big wings, to meet German raids, with overwhelming numbers. Dowding and Keith Park had continued to send fighters up in smaller units, faster, more flexibly, catching raids on the way in rather than after they had bombed. Dowding had been right. Park had been right. The results proved it. But Dowding was 58 years old. He was not liked. He was not warm. He did not play politics well. The men who wanted him gone were younger, better connected, and better at moving through the Air Ministry corridors. He was replaced by Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas. He was told he was being sent to the United States on a technical mission. He went. He came back. He retired in 1942. He spent his later years writing books on spiritualism, corresponding with the parents of dead pilots, and trying, in his quiet, distant way, to make sense of what he had lived through. He was created Baron Dowding in 1943. He died on the 15th of February, 1970. He was 87 years old. His ashes are buried in the Royal Air Force Chapel of Westminster Abbey, beneath the Battle of Britain Memorial window. There is a statue of him outside the RAF Church of St. Clement Danes in London. Neither the statue nor the burial place is much visited. The fourth name is Keith Park. On the 18th of December, 1940, 24 days after Dowding was removed, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park was moved out of 11 Group. He was posted to Training Command. Training Command was where the RAF sent officers whose careers were finished. The New Zealander, who had run the critical sector of the Battle of Britain, who had flown his own personal Hurricane between his airfields, who had told Winston Churchill that there were no reserves, was reassigned to teaching flight instructors. He accepted the posting without complaint. 2 years later, in 1942, he was sent to Malta to command the air defense of the besieged island. He applied the same tactical doctrine he had used over Kent and broke the Luftwaffe's campaign over Malta as he had broken it over London. The RAF gave him progressively better commands after that. He finished the war as Allied Air Commander-in-Chief, Southeast Asia. He returned to New Zealand after the war. He worked in civilian aviation. He kept his mouth shut about what had happened to him in December of 1940. He waited 30 years for any formal acknowledgement of what he had done in the summer of that same year. He died in 1975. He was 82 years old. His ashes were scattered from a hurricane over the Thames estuary, at his request. Over the same water he had watched fill with German bomber formations in September of 1940. There is one more name. The one we started with. Werner Mulders. In the months after his report at Rechlin, Mulders returned to combat. He continued to score victories. By the end of 1940, his personal total stood at 55. He was the leading fighter pilot on the Channel front. In July of 1941, he became the first fighter pilot in aviation history to score 100 confirmed victories. He was promoted to colonel and appointed inspector of fighters. The youngest man ever to hold that office in the Luftwaffe, at just 20 years old. And then, in the summer of 1941, he was pulled out of combat. The order came from Hermann Göring himself. Mulders was too valuable to lose. He had become too much of a symbol. He was to serve, as inspector of fighters, an office job in Berlin. He was forbidden to fly operational missions. Mulders hated it. He wrote to his family. He wrote to Göring. He asked to be returned to his squadron. The answer was no. On the 22nd of November, 1941, Werner Mulders received word that Ernst Udet, the flying ace of the First World War, who had become the Luftwaffe's director of aircraft procurement, had died. Officially, Udet had died in a test flight accident. In reality, Udet had shot himself. Mulders was ordered to attend the state funeral in Berlin. He was in the Crimea when the order arrived. To reach Berlin quickly, he boarded a Heinkel 111 transport aircraft at Chaplinka airfield in southern Ukraine. The weather was poor. The aircraft flew north through worsening conditions. Over Breslau, in what is now western Poland, one of the aircraft's engines failed. The pilot attempted an emergency landing. In heavy rain and low visibility, the Heinkel struck a factory chimney and crashed. Werner Mulders was killed. He was 20 years old. He had been forbidden from combat because he was too valuable to lose. He died in a transport aircraft, on his way to a funeral, in bad weather, because a single engine failed at the wrong moment. The man who had written that the hurricane was decidedly inferior was killed by the same category of misfortune the hurricane had spent the previous summer inflicting on his colleagues. A machine that failed at the wrong moment. A crew that could not save the aircraft. A silence over the wreckage. He had been right about the hurricane on paper. He had measured the aircraft. He had not measured the system it lived inside. He had not measured Sidney Cam, or Hugh Dowding, or Keith Park, or Lord Beaverbrook, or the young women in blue uniforms in the filter rooms, or the ground crews, who returned the aircraft to service in 9 minutes, or the Czech pilot named Josef František, who had lost 3 countries before he reached England. He had measured a machine. And been killed, in the end, by a machine. The final number. By the end of the Battle of Britain, the Hawker Hurricane had been credited with the destruction of approximately 656 German aircraft. Roughly 55% of all Luftwaffe losses in the battle. More than every Spitfire. More than every anti-aircraft gun. More than any other single RAF fighter type during the Battle of Britain. Every barrage balloon, every mechanical failure, every accidental collision combined. The aircraft the Luftwaffe had dismissed. The aircraft Werner Mulders had rated inferior. The aircraft built by a carpenter's son, from Windsor, who had refused to give up his fabric fuselage, when everyone else in Europe had moved to stressed skin aluminum. Sidney Cam never became famous. Reginald Mitchell, who designed the Spitfire, had died of cancer in 1937, before the aircraft he had built had fought a single battle. He would become a mythic figure, memorialized in films, and speeches and countless books. Sidney Cam outlived Mitchell by nearly 30 years, and outbuilt him by every measurable standard, and no film was ever made about him. Cam continued to design aircraft after the war. He designed the Typhoon. He designed the Tempest. He designed the Hunter, which flew for decades. He laid the foundations for the aircraft that eventually became the Harrier. He was knighted in 1953. He remained difficult, precise, and patient with fools, and largely indifferent to praise. He died on the 12th of March, 1966, of a heart attack on the golf course of the Richmond Park Golf Club in Surrey. He was 72 years old. His obituary in the Times was respectful, professional, and largely forgotten by the following week. The men who flew his aircraft in the summer of 1940 did not forget him. They spoke of the Hurricane, in old age, with the affection men reserve for a farm horse that has carried them through a war. Not the fastest. Not the most beautiful. Not the one they put on the recruiting posters. The one that brought them home. The one that kept coming back. The one that killed the bombers, day after day, week after week, through the summer, that decided whether there would still be a Britain. Werner Mulders had written the truth, in the beginning of August, 1940, at Rechlin. He had written that the Hurricane was decidedly inferior. He was correct. He was correct on every specification. He was correct on every performance figure. He was correct on every measurable technical criterion. And in the 81 days between the moment he wrote those words and the moment the Battle of Britain officially ended, the aircraft he had rated inferior played a decisive role in defeating the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain. He was right. And it did not matter. Because the war was not a specification sheet. The war was a system. The war was a factory. The war was a 9-minute turnaround, and a fabric fuselage, and a Czech pilot, who had lost everything, and a 23-year-old flight lieutenant, with his hands on fire, and a 58-year-old air marshal, who did not smile. The war was everything Werner Mulders could not measure, from the cockpit of a captured Hurricane on a summer morning in Mecklenburg. He wrote his assessment. He signed it. He handed it to the courier. The clock that had started at Rechlin, the one neither man could hear, finally ran out. 81 days. 656 German aircraft. One war.